My own son texted me, "You're not family. You can't come to the party." I read that line 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I couldn't believe that after raising him for 38 years, pouring every ounce of my soul into making sure he had everything he needed, sacrificing my own dreams so he could chase his, working double shifts when his father left us with nothing but broken promises and empty bank accounts, staying up nights when he was sick, cheering at every game, celebrating every achievement as if it were my own. I had just been uninvited from my own bloodline. That's when something inside me broke and something stronger woke up. Before we begin, please like this video, subscribe to Elderly Stories, and comment where you're watching from, because what you're about to hear isn't just revenge, it's rebirth. It's the story of a woman who gave everything and was told it meant nothing. It's the story of how I learned that sometimes losing your place at someone else's table is exactly how you find your own home. Let me tell you about those weeks. Every single day, I woke up with excitement bubbling in my chest like I was the one turning 40, not him. I made lists upon lists, checking them twice, 3 times. I researched recipes online, spent hours in grocery stores comparing prices, because even though I'd given them so much over the years, I was still careful with every penny. I wanted everything to be perfect for my boy. I baked his favorite chocolate cake from scratch, the same recipe I'd used for every birthday since he was 5 years old. The one that took me 3 tries to get right the first time, back when we lived in that tiny apartment and I had to borrow eggs from the neighbor because I couldn't afford to mess up again. My hands remembered every fold of the batter, every minute of baking time. I could have made that cake blindfolded. I ordered gifts that I researched for weeks. Not expensive gifts. I couldn't afford expensive, but thoughtful ones. Meaningful ones. A photo album filled with pictures from his childhood that I'd been saving for years, each one carefully chosen and arranged. A book by his favorite author that I knew he'd been wanting but wouldn't buy for himself because he was always so practical about money, just like I taught him to be. A sweater in his favorite color that I'd seen him admire in a store window months ago. I sent invitations, those invitations. I spent an entire evening crafting the perfect message, something warm and loving that would make everyone excited to celebrate my son. I included little personal notes to each family member, reminiscing about shared memories, expressing how grateful I was that they'd be there to mark this special day. I sealed each envelope with such care, with such love, with such anticipation for the joy we'd all share together. All in secret joy. Secret because I wanted to surprise him, but also secret because somewhere deep down, I think I was protecting myself from the possibility that it might not matter to him as much as it mattered to me. That quiet voice in the back of my mind that I'd been ignoring for years, the one that whispered that maybe I cared more about these moments than anyone else did. The phone buzzed while I was arranging flowers, yellow roses, his favorite, even though they cost more than I usually spent on flowers. I almost didn't check it right away because I was so focused on getting the arrangement just right. When I finally picked up that phone and saw his name on the screen, my heart did that little flutter it always did when he contacted me. My boy was thinking of me. It's for family only. 6 words. 22 characters including spaces. I counted them later when I was trying to understand how so few letters could carry so much cruelty. There was no, "Hi Mom," no, "I hope you understand," no, "I'm sorry but." Just those 6 words, delivered like a legal notice, like a restraining order, like a door slamming shut. Family only. As if I wasn't the one who created the very concept of family for him when his father walked out. As if I wasn't the one who worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat, who went without meals so he could eat, who wore the same coat for 5 winters so he could have new school clothes. As if I wasn't the one who held him when nightmares made him cry, who taught him to tie his shoes and ride a bike and treat people with kindness. Family only. Like I was some distant acquaintance he'd met at a coffee shop, Not the woman who pushed him into this world after 18 hours of labor, who counted his fingers and toes and promised him I'd love him forever no matter what. Like I was a stranger who'd happened to be around for his childhood, not the person who knew exactly how he liked his sandwiches cut and what song could calm him down when he was upset and which teacher at school he had a crush on in 3rd grade. Cold. That's what hit me first. Not the rejection, the temperature of it. No warmth, no regret, no acknowledgement of what this might do to me. Just efficient dismissal, like he was canceling a subscription or declining a sales call. The kind of text you send to someone you don't care about hurting because they don't matter enough for you to worry about their feelings. Final. That's what hit me second. There was no room for discussion in those words, no invitation to talk it through or find a compromise. This wasn't a difficult conversation he was postponing. This was a verdict he'd already reached, a decision that had been made without my input, without my knowledge, without any consideration for the fact that I might have thoughts or feelings about being excluded from my own son's life. The balloons hung there like deflated dreams. I'd blown them up one by one, each breath filled with anticipation, with love, with excitement for a celebration that would never happen. Bright colors that suddenly looked garish and mocking in the lamplight. Birthday balloons for a party I wasn't invited to. Decorations for a joy I wasn't allowed to share. The gift sat on my coffee table, wrapped in paper I'd chosen so carefully, blue with silver stars, because he'd always loved looking at the night sky when he was little. I'd used the good ribbon, the expensive kind that makes that satisfying rustle when you pull it. I'd even practiced the bow 3 times to make sure it was perfect. Now it looked like evidence of my own foolishness, proof that I'd been living in a fantasy where my love was wanted and reciprocated. But as I stood there in that quiet room, surrounded by the remnants of my misplaced excitement, something much more painful than disappointment settled over me. Recognition. The slow, dawning realization that this wasn't a sudden cruelty, it was just the first time the truth had been said out loud. I'd been celebrating alone for years. All those birthdays where he seemed distracted, where conversation felt forced, where I did most of the talking while he checked his phone. All those holidays where I cooked for hours and he ate quickly and left early. All those times I called and got voicemail, texted and got one-word responses, invited myself over and sensed I was interrupting something more important. The signs had been there. I'd just been too desperate to maintain the illusion of closeness to see them clearly. Too afraid of losing him to acknowledge that I'd already lost him somewhere along the way. Too invested in the idea of being needed to recognize that I'd become convenient at best, burdensome at worst. He hadn't suddenly stopped loving me. He gradually stopped including me, and I'd been too busy loving him to notice the difference. I'd been throwing birthday parties for a relationship that had died years ago, keeping traditions alive that only mattered to me, celebrating connections that existed more in my memory than in our present reality. That living room felt huge and small at the same time. Huge because I was so alone in it, because the silence seemed to echo off the walls and remind me that no one was coming to share this space or this moment or this pain. Small because it suddenly felt like a shrine to my own delusion, cramped with evidence of how desperately I'd been clinging to something that was already gone. Darkness came not gradually, the way it usually does when evening settles in peacefully, but all at once, like someone had thrown a blanket over my world. I didn't turn on the lights. What was the point? The darkness outside matched the darkness inside, and trying to illuminate the room would only highlight how empty it was, how empty I was. I sat on my couch, the same couch where I'd nursed him as a baby, where I'd read him bedtime stories, where I'd helped him with homework, where I'd listened to his teenage problems and tried to offer advice that he usually ignored but sometimes, rarely, actually took. Now it felt like a museum exhibit. Here sat a mother who thought she mattered. The silence was so complete it had weight. No television, no music, no phone calls, no laughter from the next room. Just me and the sound of my own breathing, which seemed too loud and too shallow and too much like the breathing of someone who was drowning on dry land. I thought about calling someone, but who? My sister lived 3 states away and had her own problems. My few friends had gradually drifted away over the years as I'd become more and more focused on being available for my son and his family. I'd turned down invitations, canceled plans, rearranged my schedule so many times to accommodate their needs that eventually people stopped calling. I'd made my son the center of my universe, and now that he'd kicked me out of orbit, I was floating alone in space. The night pressed against the windows like it was trying to get in, or maybe like it was trying to remind me that this was what the rest of my life might look like: dark, quiet, solitary. Hours stretching ahead with no purpose, no one to care for, no one who needed me, no one who even wanted to remember that I existed. Time moved differently in that darkness. Minutes felt like hours, hours felt like minutes. I'd check the clock and be surprised that only 20 minutes had passed since the last time I looked, then check again and discover that somehow 3 hours had disappeared without me noticing. Time is different when you have nowhere to be and no one expecting you. I couldn't avoid them even in the darkness. They were everywhere, these monuments to a love story I'd apparently been telling myself. On the mantle, on the end tables, on the walls, on my dresser. Decades of careful curation, each photo chosen and placed with such intention, such pride, such certainty that I was documenting something beautiful and permanent. His wedding photo mocked me from its silver frame. I remembered that day so clearly, how handsome he looked in his tuxedo, how radiant his bride was, how proud I felt standing next to them in family photos. I'd helped pay for that wedding, contributed thousands of dollars I didn't really have because I wanted their day to be perfect. I'd hosted the bridal shower, helped with the planning, stayed up late addressing invitations in my careful handwriting. In the photo, we're all smiling. My arm is around his shoulders, his new wife is beaming next to us, and we look like what I thought we were, a family. People who belonged together, who chose each other, who would always have each other's backs. Now I stared at that image and wondered if he was already pulling away from me even then, if his smile was genuine or just polite, if he was counting the minutes until he could start his new life without his embarrassing, over-involved mother. The graduation photo was worse. Him in his cap and gown, me standing next to him with tears of pride streaming down my face. Literal tears, captured forever on film, evidence of how much his achievements meant to me. I'd worked overtime for months to help him through college, had sent care packages and encouraging texts and money I couldn't spare. I'd celebrated every good grade like it was my own, had worried through every difficult semester like his stress was mine to carry. Looking at that photo now, I could see how one-sided my joy was. His smile was polite, distant. He was already looking toward his future, and apparently I wasn't in it. I was just the stepping stone he'd needed to get where he wanted to go, useful for tuition payments and emotional support, but not worthy of inclusion in the life those investments had made possible. But the baby photos were the cruelest. Picture after picture of me holding this tiny, perfect human who depended on me for everything. His fingers wrapped around mine, his head nestled against my chest, his eyes looking up at me with complete trust and love. This was back when I was his whole world, when my voice could soothe him, when my presence meant safety and comfort and home. When did that change? When did I go from being his everything to being nothing? When did the person who made him feel safe become someone he needed protection from? When did the love in those baby pictures curdle into the obligation that he'd finally decided to shed? I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror as I walked past, and I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. When had I gotten so old? When had those lines appeared around my eyes, those gray streaks become so prominent in my hair? When had I started looking like someone's discarded mother instead of someone's beloved mom? The woman in the mirror looked tired. Not just sleepy tired, but soul tired. Worn down by years of trying too hard, caring too much, giving more than was wanted or appreciated. She looked like someone who'd been running a race where the finish line kept moving further away, who'd been playing a game where the rules changed without anyone telling her. "You're not family anymore," the reflection seemed to say, and the words hit harder coming from my own face than they had from his text. Because deep down, I think I'd known it was true. I think I'd felt myself becoming an outsider in my own son's life for years, but I'd been too scared to acknowledge it, too desperate to maintain the connection to admit it was already broken. I thought about all the times I'd felt like an intruder in their home, even though I'd helped them buy it. All the conversations that stopped when I entered the room, all the inside jokes I didn't understand, all the plans they made without thinking to include me. I'd told myself it was natural, young couples need their space. They're building their own traditions. They don't want to hurt my feelings by not inviting me to everything. But that was all bullshit, wasn't it? The truth was simpler and much more painful. I'd become inconvenient. My love had become a burden they were tired of carrying. My presence had become an obligation they were ready to shed. My care had become suffocating instead of comforting, annoying instead of appreciated. The woman in the mirror looked like someone who'd been lying to herself for years, who'd been accepting crumbs and calling them a feast, who'd been so grateful for any attention that she'd never demanded the respect she deserved. She looked like someone who'd forgotten her own worth in the desperate attempt to remain worthy of someone else's love. "You're not family anymore," she whispered again, and this time I heard something else in those words. Not just rejection, but possibility. If I wasn't family anymore, if I didn't belong to them, then maybe I could belong to myself again. Maybe I could stop performing love for an audience that had stopped watching. Maybe I could stop being the supporting character in someone else's story and start being the protagonist of my own. The tears stopped. Not gradually, not with effort, but suddenly, like a faucet being turned off. Because underneath all that pain, underneath all that rejection and humiliation and heartbreak, something else was rising. Something that felt dangerous and clean and powerful. I'd built their life. Not just emotionally, not just through love and support and endless sacrifice, but literally, financially, practically. With my money, my credit, my signature on documents, my name on deeds and mortgages and insurance policies. I'd been so focused on being the loving, giving, selfless mother that I'd forgotten I was also the one holding the foundation of their comfortable existence. Their house, the one where they hosted parties I wasn't invited to, where they entertained friends who'd probably never heard my name, where they built their family-only life, that house was mine. Not morally mine, not emotionally mine, but legally mine. My name on the deed, my credit on the mortgage, my money for the down payment. For years, I'd been so grateful to be included in their lives that I'd never thought about what inclusion cost me. I'd paid and paid and paid, not just in money but in dignity, not just in resources but in respect for myself. I'd been so afraid of losing them that I'd lost myself instead, so desperate to be needed that I'd forgotten I had power. But I did have power. Real power. Legal power. Financial power. The kind of power that doesn't depend on someone else's love or approval or recognition. The kind of power that exists on paper and in bank accounts and in legal documents that don't care about feelings or family dynamics or who's invited to birthday parties. I thought about all the times I'd bitten my tongue when his wife was rude to me, all the times I'd accepted leftovers of affection and been grateful for them, all the times I'd diminished myself to make room for their comfort. I'd been playing by rules they'd created. Rules that said I should be grateful for whatever scraps of inclusion they threw my way. Rules that said a mother's love means never saying no, never standing up for yourself, never demanding better treatment. But those weren't real rules. Those were just the terms of an agreement I'd never actually signed, conditions I'd accepted without negotiating. And if they could change the terms, if they could decide I wasn't family anymore, if they could uninvite me from celebrations I'd helped plan and pay for, then maybe I could change the terms too. The sharp thing stirring in my chest wasn't revenge, exactly. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop pretending things are different than they are, when you finally admit that being treated badly isn't the same as being loved, When you finally recognize that giving everything doesn't entitle you to anything, but it also doesn't obligate you to keep giving forever. I wasn't looking for it. I was just trying to find something, anything, to occupy my mind with tasks that didn't involve thinking about birthday parties or family or the 38 years of motherhood that had apparently meant nothing. I started cleaning out drawers, organizing papers, the kind of mindless busy work you do when sitting still feels impossible. The deed was in my desk drawer, filed away between old tax returns and insurance policies. I'd put it there years ago when we first bought the house, back when I thought of it as an investment in their future, a gift that would give them stability and security and a foundation to build their dreams on. I'd been so proud to help them, so happy to make their homeownership possible when they couldn't qualify for a mortgage on their own. My name, right there in black ink on legal paper. Not Mr. and Mrs. anything. Not his name with mine as a cosigner afterthought. Just my name, clean and clear and undeniable. The legal owner of the property where my son lived with his wife, where they hosted their family-only gatherings, where they built their life that apparently had no room for me. I ran my finger over those letters like I was reading Braille, like I needed to touch them to believe they were real. How had I forgotten? How had I become so focused on being grateful for their attention that I'd forgotten I was the one making their comfort possible? How had I let them treat me like a guest in a house I owned? The irony was sharp enough to cut. They'd uninvited me from their party, told me I wasn't family, made me feel like an outsider in their lives. But I was literally the reason they had a place to live, the foundation underneath every comfortable evening they spent together, the legal basis for every sense of security they felt in their home. I read the deed 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I couldn't believe I'd let myself forget it existed. This wasn't just a piece of paper. This was power. This was leverage. This was proof that I wasn't just some pathetic old woman begging for scraps of affection from ungrateful children. I was a property owner who'd been allowing someone else to live in my house. But more than that, it was evidence of something I'd lost sight of completely, my own worth. Not just my financial worth, though that was significant. My worth as a person who deserved to be treated with respect, who didn't have to accept cruelty in exchange for the privilege of loving someone, who had value that existed independently of whether or not my son acknowledged it. Holding that deed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: agency. The power to make choices, to take action, to change my circumstances instead of just enduring them. I'd been so focused on what they could do to me, exclude me, hurt me, reject me, that I'd forgotten what I could do for myself. Let me tell you about that house. I'd walked through it with them when they were first looking, had listened to their dreams about which room would be the nursery, which corner would be perfect for a Christmas tree, how they'd landscape the backyard. I'd been so caught up in their excitement that I'd made their dreams my own, had seen their happiness as worth any price. The down payment came from my savings account, money I'd been putting away for my own retirement, for my own security, for the day when I might need care or assistance or just the freedom to stop working so hard. $25,000 that disappeared from my account and became the foundation of their American dream. I'd co-sign the mortgage because their credit wasn't good enough, their income wasn't stable enough, their debt-to-income ratio wasn't low enough. Without my signature, without my creditworthiness, without my financial backing, they'd still be renting some cramped apartment and complaining about throwing money away on rent instead of building equity. For years, I'd helped with the mortgage payments when money was tight. When he was between jobs, when she was on maternity leave, when unexpected expenses came up, I was the safety net that kept them from losing their home. I'd transferred money from my checking account to theirs so many times that my bank had started suggesting I set up automatic payments to make it easier. I'd helped with repairs and improvements too. When the roof leaked, when the furnace broke, when they wanted to update the kitchen, I was the one they called. Not just for money, though I provided plenty of that, but for help with planning and shopping and decision-making. I'd spent weekends painting bedrooms and organizing closets and planting gardens. That house was full of my labor, my money, my time, my care. The mortgage payments I'd covered, the repairs I'd funded, the improvements I'd helped plan and execute. I'd poured myself into that property as surely as if I'd mixed the concrete for the foundation with my own hands. But somewhere along the way, they'd started talking about it like it was theirs. Our house, they'd say. Our mortgage, our equity, our investment. They'd post pictures on social media with captions about homeownership and building wealth and achieving the American dream, with no mention of the woman who'd made it all possible. I'd been proud of that, actually. Proud that I'd been able to help them get ahead, proud that they felt secure and established, proud that I'd been able to give them something substantial instead of just emotional support or well-meaning advice. I thought it showed how much I loved them, how committed I was to their success, how generous I could be. Now I realized it showed something else entirely, how easy it was for them to take my contributions for granted, how comfortable they'd become with accepting my support without acknowledging it, how completely they'd erased me from the story of their own success. The mortgage statements came to my address. Every month, for 7 years, I'd opened envelopes and seen the balance decrease, watched the equity build, observed the slow transformation of debt into ownership. I'd felt proud of those statements, proud that I was helping them build something permanent and valuable. But when they talked to friends, when they posted on social media, when they filled out applications or answered surveys about home ownership, it was always, we bought our house, and we're building equity, and we're so grateful to be homeowners. Never, my mother made this possible, or we couldn't have done this without help, or even just we were lucky to have family support. I'd told myself it didn't matter. I'd convinced myself that I didn't need credit or recognition, that helping them was its own reward, that seeing them happy and secure was worth more than acknowledgement. I'd been so determined to be the selfless, generous mother that I'd trained them to see my contributions as invisible, my sacrifices as automatic, my support as something they were entitled to rather than something they should be grateful for. The maintenance costs had added up over the years. New water heater, roof repairs, foundation work, HVAC maintenance, appliance replacements. They'd call me when something broke, not because they wanted my advice, but because they needed my money. And I'd always said yes, always transferred funds, always made their problems my problems. I'd trusted them completely. Trusted that they valued what I was doing for them. Trusted that they understood the magnitude of my support. Trusted that they saw me as an essential part of their success story. I'd trusted that my generosity was building a stronger relationship, that my financial support was an investment in our emotional connection, that my willingness to help would translate into respect and appreciation and inclusion. That trust hadn't just been naive, it had been expensive. Not just in money, though the financial cost had been substantial, but in dignity. I'd trusted them with my retirement security, my financial future, my sense of self-worth. I'd trusted them to treat me like a partner in their success instead of a convenient ATM machine. They'd built their comfort on my foundation and then acted like they'd done it alone. They'd used my money to create the life they wanted and then decided that life didn't have room for me. They'd taken my support for granted for so long that they'd forgotten it wasn't automatic, forgotten it was a choice I made, forgotten that choices can be unmade. Something shifted in that moment, something fundamental and irreversible. The grief that had been drowning me suddenly crystallized into something sharper, cleaner, more purposeful. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I wasn't just someone things happened to. I was someone who could make things happen. My hands had been shaking for hours from emotion, from shock, from the physical impact of having my heart broken so completely. But holding that deed, understanding what it meant, recognizing the power it represented, my hands became steady. Rock steady. The steadiness that comes not from calm but from certainty, from knowing exactly what needs to be done. I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake worrying about their finances, all the times I'd transferred money I couldn't really afford to spare, all the stress I'd carried about their mortgage payments and property taxes and insurance premiums. I'd been so focused on protecting their stability that I'd forgotten to protect my own dignity. The tears were done. Not because the pain was gone, that ache was still there, would probably always be there, but because crying wasn't useful anymore. Grief was just the first phase of this process. Now it was time for action, for decision-making, for taking control of a situation that had been controlling me for too long. I looked around my empty living room again, but this time I didn't see evidence of my loneliness. I saw evidence of my independence. This was my space, filled with my things, decorated according to my tastes, paid for with my money. I didn't need anyone's permission to be here, didn't need anyone's approval to belong here, didn't need anyone's invitation to matter here. For the first time in decades, I felt like myself again. Not someone's mother, not someone's supporter, not someone's safety net, but myself. A woman with resources and options and the legal right to make decisions about her own property. A woman who didn't have to accept disrespect, who didn't have to beg for inclusion, who didn't have to settle for being treated like she was disposable. The words came out quiet but firm, like an oath being sworn or a promise being made. Not to anyone else, there was no one else there to hear them but to myself. A commitment to stop living according to other people's rules, other people's schedules, other people's definitions of what I deserved. For decades, I'd been the one who adapted. When he was little, I'd rearranged my work schedule around his school events, had given up social activities to be available for carpools and playdates and homework help. When he was a teenager, I'd adjusted my expectations to accommodate his moods, his independence, his need for space. When he got married, I'd stepped back to make room for his wife, had learned to ask permission to visit, had accepted smaller and smaller roles in his life. I'd been so focused on being flexible, on being accommodating, on never being the difficult mother or the demanding mother-in-law, that I'd forgotten I was allowed to have needs too. I'd been so afraid of being seen as selfish that I'd become completely selfless, so worried about being too much that I'd made myself not enough. But it was my turn now. My turn to make plans that served my interests. My turn to make decisions based on what I wanted instead of what everyone else needed. My turn to use my resources for my own benefit instead of constantly giving them away to people who didn't appreciate them. The plans I'd been following weren't even my plans, they were plans other people had made for me, roles other people had assigned to me, expectations other people had created for how I should behave, and what I should want, and how I should respond to being treated poorly. I'd been following a script written by people who didn't value me, performing in a play where I was always the supporting character. Time to write my own script. Time to direct my own life. Time to stop being reactive and start being proactive. Stop accepting what was offered and start demanding what I deserved. Stop hoping for better treatment and start creating better circumstances. The power to change the plans had always been mine. I'd just forgotten I had it, had gotten so used to being accommodating that I'd forgotten accommodation was a choice, not an obligation. So used to putting everyone else first that I'd forgotten I was allowed to put myself first sometimes. So used to being grateful for scraps that I'd forgotten I deserved a full meal. "It's my turn," I whispered again, and this time the words felt like freedom. I woke up clear-headed for the first time in months. Maybe years. The kind of clarity that comes after a fever breaks, after confusion lifts, after you finally stop fighting reality and start working with it instead. I knew exactly what I needed to do, and I knew exactly how to do it. I made coffee, real coffee, not the instant stuff I'd been drinking to save money for their expenses, and sat at my kitchen table with my phone and the property deed. The realtor's number came from a simple Google search. Best real estate agents in my area. I wanted someone good, someone who would get this done quickly and efficiently, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions about why I was selling. The phone rang twice before a cheerful voice answered. "Sarah Mitchell Real Estate. This is Sarah." "Hi," I said, and my voice was steadier than it had been in days. "I'd like to sell a house." No anger. That was the strange part. I'd expected to feel rage, to be driven by fury and the desire for revenge. But sitting there in my kitchen, holding the deed and planning the sale, I felt peaceful, calm. Like I was finally doing something that made sense, something that aligned with reality instead of fighting against it. This wasn't about hurting them, though I knew it would hurt them. This wasn't about punishment, though I knew they'd see it as punishment. This was about self-respect. This was about recognizing that I'd been enabling a relationship dynamic that was toxic for everyone involved, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is stop enabling. I'd been pouring money and energy and emotional labor into a house that sheltered people who didn't want me in their lives. I'd been subsidizing the comfort of people who found my presence uncomfortable. I'd been literally paying for the privilege of being excluded, funding the very security that allowed them to reject me without consequences. That didn't make sense. It had never made sense. I'd just been too afraid of losing them to see how senseless it was, too desperate to maintain connection to recognize that what we had wasn't really connection at all. It was dependency, but only flowing in one direction. Sarah, the realtor, was professional and efficient. She asked about the property details, the location, the current condition. She didn't ask why I was selling, didn't push for personal information, didn't seem surprised that I wanted to move quickly. "We can have it listed by tomorrow," she said. "And in this market, it should sell fast." No hesitation. Every answer came easily because I'd already thought through every angle, already considered every consequence, already accepted every outcome. This was the right decision. Not because it would hurt them, though it would, and not because it would benefit me financially, though it would, but because it was honest. It was the first honest thing I'd done in years. Those 5 words carried the weight of decades. Decades of being taken for granted, of being treated like my contributions were invisible, of being made to feel grateful for the opportunity to be used. But they also carried the weight of liberation, of finally recognizing my own power, of choosing self-respect over self-sacrifice. Sarah was all business. "Great. Let me get some information from you. What's the address?" I gave her the address of the house my son lived in, the house I'd helped him buy, the house I'd been helping him maintain, the house where he hosted parties I wasn't invited to. It felt surreal to be discussing it like any other piece of real estate, like any other business transaction, instead of as the emotional investment it had been for me. "And you're the sole owner?" "Yes." That felt good to say. Clear and uncomplicated and true. I was the sole owner. Not co-owner, not partial owner, not someone whose name was on the deed as a technicality or convenience. The owner. The person with the legal right to make decisions about this property. "Have you discussed this with any current tenants or occupants?" "No." Another clear, simple answer. I didn't owe them a discussion. I didn't owe them advance warning. I didn't owe them the opportunity to talk me out of it or negotiate or make promises they wouldn't keep. They'd made their decision about my role in their lives without consulting me. I could make my decision about my property without consulting them. Any particular timeline you're hoping for? As soon as possible. Because clarity has momentum, and I didn't want to lose it. Because decisions like this get harder the longer you wait, the more you overthink them, the more you let other people's potential reactions influence your choices. Because I'd spent too many years already accommodating other people's timelines instead of following my own. Sarah walked me through the process. Market analysis, staging recommendations, listing photography, showing schedules. All practical, businesslike, focused on maximizing the sale price and minimizing the time on market. No drama, no emotion, no family dynamics. Just real estate. It was refreshing to have a conversation where my value was recognized and respected. Where my ownership mattered. Where my decisions were taken seriously. Where I wasn't being managed or manipulated or made to feel guilty for having needs and boundaries. "I'll send you the paperwork this afternoon," Sarah said. "We can have this listed tomorrow if you're ready to move forward." I was ready. More ready than I'd been for anything in years. The timing was perfect, though I hadn't planned it that way. Sarah had scheduled the first showing for Saturday evening. the same evening as the birthday party I'd been uninvited from. While my son was celebrating with the family that apparently didn't include me, potential buyers were touring the house I owned. I drove by around 7 o'clock, not to spy or cause drama, but to meet Sarah and hand over the keys. The house looked beautiful in the evening light, well-maintained and welcoming. I'd helped choose the paint colors, had contributed to the landscaping costs, had encouraged them to invest in improvements that would maintain the property value. Now those improvements would benefit me instead of them. Cars were pulling into the driveway, not guests arriving for a party, but prospective buyers arriving for a showing. I watched a young couple get out of a Honda, followed by a family with 2 small children, followed by what looked like an older couple possibly looking to downsize. Normal people living normal lives, excited about the possibility of homeownership, completely unaware of the family drama their presence represented. Sarah met me at the curb with her bright real estate agent smile and professional clipboard. "Beautiful property," she said. "We've already had 12 people request showings. I think this is going to go quickly." I handed her the keys to a house I'd been visiting as a guest, keys to property I'd somehow forgotten I owned, keys to a future I was finally taking control of. It felt ceremonial, like a changing of the guard, like passing a torch from one phase of my life to another. Inside, I could see flashlights moving from room to room as the showing began. The living room where I'd been welcome until I wasn't. The kitchen where I'd cooked countless meals for family gatherings that had gradually excluded me. The bedrooms I'd helped furnish and decorate. The bathroom where I'd hung artwork they'd never bothered to comment on. Now strangers were walking through those spaces, evaluating them with fresh eyes, seeing potential instead of history, thinking about their own futures instead of being trapped in the past. They were looking at square footage and natural light and closet space and neighborhood schools. They were seeing a house, not a symbol of rejection. And somewhere in that same house, my son was raising a glass with the family I wasn't part of, completely unaware that his security was being evaluated by people who might replace him. Completely unaware that the foundation of his comfort was shifting beneath his feet, that the woman he'd dismissed as not family was the same woman who controlled whether he had a roof over his head. The irony was so perfect it almost felt orchestrated by the universe. While he was celebrating his independence from me, strangers were appraising the dependence he didn't even know he had. 3 weeks. That's how long it took from listing to closing. Sarah had been right about the market. We received 4 offers within the first weekend, ended up in a bidding war that pushed the final price $15,000 above asking. Cash offer, quick closing, no complications. I didn't tell them about the sale. Not when we went under contract, not when we scheduled the closing, not when we set the move-out date. They would have tried to talk me out of it, would have made promises they wouldn't keep, would have managed to make me feel guilty for reclaiming my own property. So I didn't give them the opportunity. The locks were changed the day of closing, standard procedure for any property transfer. New keys for new owners, clean break from the past. I kept one set temporarily, just long enough to supervise the transition, just long enough to make sure my personal items were removed from the house. Because I was gone too. Not just from their house, but from their city, from their sphere of influence, from the geographical proximity that had made their taking me for granted so convenient. I'd used part of the proceeds from the house sale to buy a small cottage 3 hours away, near the ocean, in a town where no one knew my history or my failures or my previous willingness to accept poor treatment. When my son came home from whatever trip or celebration had kept him away during the closing process, he found strangers living in what he'd thought was his house. New cars in the driveway, different furniture visible through the windows, a clear sign that the life he'd taken for granted had fundamentally changed. The first call came at 11:47 p.m. I know because I looked at my phone when it rang, saw his name on the screen, and made a conscious choice not to answer. The second call came 3 minutes later. Then the text started, "Mom, what's going on, and why are there people in our house, and call me back right now. But I was already gone. Not just physically, though I was settling into my new cottage by then, but emotionally. I detached from the drama, from the panic, from the need to manage his emotions or fix his problems or explain my decisions. For the first time in decades, his emergency wasn't automatically my emergency. This wasn't spite. Spite would have involved wanting to hurt him, wanting to see him suffer, wanting revenge for the years of being taken for granted. This was something cleaner than spite, self-respect. The recognition that I deserved better treatment and the willingness to stop accepting worse treatment. Liberation. That's what it felt like. Like finally putting down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten how heavy it was. Like finally stepping out of a role I'd been playing so long I'd forgotten it was just a performance. Like finally choosing myself after decades of choosing everyone else. Mom, what did you do? His voice when I finally answered the phone was a mixture of panic and indignation, fear and entitlement. The voice of someone who'd just discovered that the safety net he'd never acknowledged was gone, that the foundation he'd taken for granted had shifted, that the woman he'd dismissed as not family had more power over his life than he'd realized. What did I do? I repeated his question back to him, keeping my voice calm and level. I sold my house. Your house? That's our house. We live there. You can't just sell it without telling us. Interesting. Suddenly it was my house when convenient for his argument, but it had been their house when they wanted to exclude me from their lives. Suddenly my ownership mattered when it affected them, but it hadn't mattered when I was seeking inclusion and respect. Actually, I said, I can sell it without telling you. Because it's my house. My name on the deed, my name on the mortgage, my money for the down payment. I can do whatever I want with my own property. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller, more desperate, the voice of someone who was finally understanding the magnitude of his miscalculation. But where are we supposed to live? We can't afford another house payment. We thought this was our house. You thought wrong. No anger in my voice, just facts. You thought a lot of things that turned out to be incorrect. You thought I'd always be available to subsidize your lifestyle. You thought you could treat me poorly without consequences. You thought I'd accept being excluded from family events while still funding your family's comfort. Mom, please. We can talk about this. We can work something out. Now he wanted to talk. Now he was interested in working something out. Now he was using the word please and calling me mom instead of telling me I wasn't family. Funny how quickly the dynamic changed when he needed something from me instead of just wanting me to go away. The irony was so perfect I almost smiled. He told me I wasn't family, that I couldn't come to the party because it was for family only. So I'd taken his words to heart and acted accordingly. If I wasn't family, then I didn't need to concern myself with family matters like where the family lived or how they maintained their lifestyle. You told me I wasn't family, I continued, my voice still calm and factual. So I stopped acting like family. Family helps each other with housing costs. Family includes each other in celebrations. Family treats each other with respect and consideration. Since you made it clear I wasn't family, I stopped providing family benefits. That's not what I meant and you know it. What did you mean then? When you texted me that the party was for family only, what exactly did you mean if not that I'm not part of your family? Another long silence. Because what could he say? That he'd meant I wasn't family enough to be included but was still family enough to pay for things? That he'd meant I wasn't family when it came to social events, but was still family when it came to financial support? That he'd meant I should act like a stranger when convenient for him, but like a mother when convenient for him? I meant. He struggled to find words that could somehow justify the unjustifiable, that could make sense of the senseless, that could explain how someone could be simultaneously family and not family depending on what he needed from them at any given moment. You meant exactly what you said, I said gently. And I listened. I took your words seriously. I respected your boundaries. You didn't want me at your family event, so I removed myself from your family obligations. You said I wasn't family, so I stopped acting like family. The logic was unassailable and we both knew it. He'd created the terms of our relationship when he'd excluded me from the party. I'd simply accepted those terms and acted accordingly. If I wasn't family enough to be included, then I wasn't family enough to be financially responsible for their lifestyle. But this is different. This affects our whole life. Yes, I agreed. It does. Just like being excluded from your celebration affected my whole sense of belonging in this family. The difference is that your actions affected my feelings and my actions affected your finances. Apparently, only one of those things matters to you. The conversation went on for nearly an hour. At some point, his wife got on the phone, her voice thick with tears, talking about how sorry they were, how they hadn't meant to hurt me, how they just wanted a small celebration, how they never thought I'd react this way. But her apologies felt hollow because they were motivated by consequence, not by genuine remorse. She wasn't sorry for hurting me, she was sorry that hurting me had cost them their house. She wasn't apologizing for the cruelty of the exclusion. She was apologizing because the exclusion had backfired. We'll include you in everything from now on, she promised through her tears. We'll have another party, a bigger party, and you'll be the guest of honor. We'll make it up to you. Please, just don't do this to us. Don't do this to them. As if I was the one doing something to them, instead of simply stopping doing things for them. As if reclaiming my own property was an attack on them, instead of a reasonable response to being told I wasn't part of their family. My voice never shook. Not during his panic, not during her tears, not during their promises and pleading and increasingly desperate attempts to negotiate. I'd found my center, my certainty, my sense of what was right and fair and long overdue. Their emotional manipulation couldn't shake me because I was standing on solid ground for the first time in years. I appreciate that you're sorry, I said, and I meant it. But apologies don't undo the damage and promises don't rebuild trust. You've shown me how you really feel about my place in your lives. I'm simply adjusting my behavior to match that reality. They begged me to reconsider, to think about the grandchildren, to remember all the good times we'd shared, to consider how this would affect the whole family. But every argument they made only reinforced my decision. If the grandchildren mattered so much, why hadn't they considered them when they excluded me? If the good times mattered so much, why hadn't they protected them by treating me with respect? If the family mattered so much, why had they told me I wasn't part of it? Their desperation was real, but it wasn't about losing me, it was about losing what I provided. They weren't crying because they'd miss my company or my love or my presence in their lives. They were crying because they'd miss my financial support, my safety net, my willingness to solve their problems. That distinction made all the difference. It clarified that I was making the right choice, that this relationship had become transactional rather than emotional, that they valued what I could do for them more than who I was to them. The words came out like poetry, like a summation of decades, like a perfectly balanced equation that finally made sense. Not angry words, not cruel words, just honest words. A simple accounting of what had been given and what had been received, what had been invested and what had been returned. I gave you life. 38 years ago, I'd brought him into this world after 18 hours of labor, had held him against my chest and promised to love and protect him forever. That was my first gift to him, existence itself, the opportunity to breathe and grow and become whoever he wanted to be. You gave me absence. In return, he'd gradually withdrawn from my life, had become less available, less present, less interested in maintaining our connection. Not absence in the physical sense, he lived nearby, we saw each other regularly, but emotional absence. The absence of consideration, of appreciation, of genuine care for my well-being. I gave you shelter. The house, the down payment, the mortgage assistance, the maintenance costs, the repairs. I'd literally provided the roof over his head, the walls that protected him, the foundation his life was built on. Shelter in every sense of the word: physical, financial, emotional. You gave me silence. When I called, he didn't answer. When I texted, he didn't respond. When I tried to share my thoughts or feelings or experiences, he wasn't interested. When I needed support or comfort or just someone to listen, he was busy with his own life. Silent when I needed him to speak, absent when I needed him to be present. I only took back what was mine. The house had always been mine legally. The financial support had always been my choice. The sacrifices had always been my decision. I hadn't stolen anything from him or taken anything that belonged to him. I had simply stopped giving him things that were mine to give or withhold. The equation was perfect in its simplicity. I had given generously and received poorly. I had invested heavily and gotten minimal returns. I had offered everything and been offered very little in return. The imbalance had been unsustainable, and now I was simply rebalancing the scales. He had nothing to say to that. What could he say? That my accounting was wrong? That he had given me more than absence and silence? That I had given him less than life and shelter? The truth was too clear, too undeniable, too stark in its accuracy. I hung up the phone with the same decisiveness he'd shown when he sent that text message. No long goodbye, no opportunity for further negotiation, no chance for him to launch into another round of promises and pleading. Just a clean ending, a clear boundary, a definitive close to a conversation that had already gone on longer than necessary. The parallel was intentional. He'd ended my dignity with 6 words and a casual dismissal. It's for family only. No discussion, no consideration for my feelings, no acknowledgement of what that rejection might cost me emotionally. Just an efficient dismissal, like canceling a subscription or declining a sales call. So I ended our call with the same efficient finality. No cruelty, no anger, no dramatic declarations or threats. Just a simple click, a dial tone, a boundary enforced with the same casualness he'd used to enforce his. The difference was that his boundary had been about excluding me from joy, while mine was about excluding myself from exploitation. His boundary had been about denying me access to celebration and family connection, while mine was about denying him access to my resources and financial support. His boundary had been about making me feel unwanted, while mine was about stopping the behavior that made me feel undervalued. But the execution was identical, swift, final, non-negotiable. The same energy he'd used to dismiss me, I used to reclaim myself. The same decisiveness he'd shown in excluding me, I showed in excluding myself from a dynamic that no longer served me. After I hung up, I turned off my phone for the rest of the evening. Not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. I knew he'd call back, probably multiple times. I knew the texts would come, each one more desperate than the last. I knew his wife would try calling from her phone, probably other family members too once word spread about what had happened. But I didn't want to be available for their panic. I didn't want to be pulled back into the drama, didn't want to second-guess my decision, didn't want to let their emotional manipulation erode the clarity I'd fought so hard to achieve. I wanted to sit with the silence, to enjoy the peace, to experience what it felt like to have boundaries that couldn't be crossed. The cottage was everything their house wasn't. Small instead of spacious, simple instead of impressive, peaceful instead of dramatic. Just 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, a living room with windows that faced the ocean. Nothing fancy, nothing designed to impress anyone, nothing that required more maintenance than I could handle myself. But it was mine. Not legally mine like the house had been. I was renting month to month, no long-term commitment, no mortgage payments, no property taxes. But emotionally mine in a way that house had never been. Every decision about how to arrange the furniture, what to hang on the walls, how to spend my evenings, was mine alone. The balcony was the best part. Just big enough for a small table and 2 chairs, though I only needed one. I'd sit there in the mornings with my coffee, watching the waves roll in, listening to the seagulls, feeling the salt air on my face. No phones ringing with requests for money, no texts asking for help with problems I hadn't created, no family drama intruding on my peace. I'd brought some of my things from the old house, the photos I actually wanted to keep, the books I loved, the dishes that held good memories. But I'd left behind the accumulated weight of decades, the furniture chosen to accommodate other people's preferences, the decorations selected to impress visitors who'd stopped coming anyway. The money from the house sale had given me options I hadn't had in years. Not wealthy options, I wasn't rich, but secure options. Enough to rent this cottage for several years if I wanted to, enough to buy a reliable car, enough to stop worrying about every expense and start thinking about what would actually make me happy. For the first time in decades, I was spending money on myself without guilt. New clothes that I liked instead of clothes that were practical. Books I wanted to read instead of gifts for other people. Restaurant meals when I didn't feel like cooking instead of groceries for family dinners where I did all the work. The ocean was healing in a way I hadn't expected. Not because it was dramatic or inspiring, but because it was constant. The waves came in and went out regardless of human drama, regardless of family conflicts, regardless of who was invited to which party. It was bigger than my problems and completely indifferent to them, which somehow made them feel smaller and more manageable. The painting started as therapy, just something to do with my hands while my mind processed everything that had happened. I bought a basic set of watercolors and some cheap paper from the local drugstore, set up a small easel on the balcony, and started trying to capture the colors of the ocean at different times of day. I was terrible at first. Muddy colors, awkward proportions, paintings that looked nothing like what I was trying to recreate. But it didn't matter because no one was judging them, no one was offering helpful criticism, no one was suggesting improvements. They were mine, created for my own satisfaction, valued only by my own standards. Gradually, I got better. Not good, I'll never be good, but better. The colors became cleaner, the shapes more recognizable, the overall effect more pleasing. I started painting other things too, the wildflowers that grew near the cottage, the lighthouse visible from my balcony, the small boats that sailed past in the evenings. Cooking for one was a revelation. For decades, I'd cooked for others, my son when he was growing up, family when they visited, guests when we entertained. Meals designed to please other people's tastes, accommodate other people's dietary restrictions, impress other people with my domestic skills. Now I cooked only what I wanted to eat. If I wanted soup for breakfast, I had soup. If I wanted ice cream for dinner, I had ice cream. If I wanted to experiment with a recipe that might turn out terribly, I experimented without worrying about wasting anyone else's time or disappointing anyone else's expectations. I rediscovered foods I'd forgotten I loved, tried cuisines I'd never explored, bought ingredients just because they looked interesting. I ate meals on the balcony watching the sunset, standing in the kitchen reading a book, sitting on the floor having an impromptu picnic. No rules, no expectations, no performance. And I laughed. Real laughter, not the polite social laughter I'd been producing for years. Not the nervous laughter that covered up uncomfortable moments, not the forced laughter that tried to smooth over family tensions. Deep, genuine laughter that came from watching seagulls fight over a dropped sandwich, from reading a funny book, from the simple absurdity of being completely free to do whatever I wanted. The laughter surprised me most of all. I'd forgotten it was possible, forgotten that joy could be uncomplicated, forgotten that happiness didn't require anyone else's approval or participation. I was laughing alone, but I wasn't lonely. I was content in a way I hadn't been in years. Peace had always seemed like something other people had, something that required perfect circumstances or resolved conflicts or family harmony. I'd thought peace would come when my son appreciated me more, when his wife included me more, when family gatherings felt warm and welcoming instead of tense and obligatory. But this peace was different. It didn't depend on other people's behavior or attitudes or decisions. It came from within, from finally aligning my actions with my values, from finally treating myself with the same respect I'd been demanding from others, from finally choosing self-preservation over self-sacrifice. Quiet peace, not dramatic peace. No fanfare, no celebration, no external validation. Just the deep, steady satisfaction of knowing I was living according to my own standards instead of constantly adjusting to meet other people's expectations. The relief of no longer performing love for an audience that had stopped watching. Golden peace, warm and valuable and precious. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you've made the right decision even when it was the hard decision, even when other people disagree with it, even when it costs you things you thought you couldn't live without. I'd spent so many years begging for a seat at their table. Not literally begging, I was too proud for that, but metaphorically begging. Accepting smaller and smaller roles in their lives, grateful for whatever inclusion they offered, adjusting my expectations downward to match their level of interest in maintaining our relationship. Always hoping for more, always disappointed by less, always trying to prove I deserved better treatment by being even more giving, even more accommodating, even more willing to accept whatever they were willing to offer. Always begging in the sense that I was asking for something they clearly didn't want to give, genuine respect, enthusiastic inclusion, reciprocal care. Now I had my own table. Small, simple, set for one, but mine. No one could uninvite me from my own life, exclude me from my own peace, make me feel unwelcome in my own space. No one could take away my seat because I was the only one who could assign seats, and I'd given myself the best one. The golden quality of this peace came from its sustainability. It didn't depend on other people's moods or decisions or life circumstances. It didn't require maintenance from anyone else, didn't need feeding from external sources, didn't demand constant vigilance to protect it from other people's negativity. This peace was mine, generated by my own choices, sustained by my own boundaries, protected by my own commitment to treating myself well. Golden because it was valuable, but also because it was refined, purified by fire, strengthened by struggle, made precious by the cost of obtaining it. The envelope was small and slightly crooked, addressed in careful child's handwriting that took its time with each letter. My name and address written in purple crayon, with a small heart drawn next to my name and a flower drawn in the corner. The return address was my son's house, the house that was no longer my son's house, the house that belonged to strangers now. I almost didn't open it. The peace I'd built was fragile in some ways, protected by distance and boundaries that could be disrupted by reminders of what I'd left behind. I'd been careful about what I let into my new life, selective about which connections were worth maintaining and which were too costly to preserve. But this was different. This wasn't from my son or his wife, wasn't another attempt to manipulate me back into a relationship that had been harming me. This was from an 8-year-old who hadn't chosen the family dynamics she'd been born into, who probably didn't understand why Grandma had suddenly moved away, who was just trying to maintain connection in the only way she knew how. Inside was a single sheet of construction paper, folded in half to make a card. On the front, she'd drawn a picture of a party scene in colored pencils, a table with a birthday cake, balloons floating overhead, stick figures standing around smiling. At the bottom, in her careful handwriting, a party where everyone has a chair. Inside the card, she'd written, "Grandma, Daddy says you live far now. I made you a drawing of a party where everyone has a chair. There's one just for you. I miss you. Love, Emma. P.S. Mommy says I can't send this, but I'm sending it anyway." I read it 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I was amazed by the emotional intelligence of a child who could identify the problem so clearly and offer such a simple, perfect solution. Everyone has a chair. What a concept. What a revolutionary idea for a family that had become so comfortable with exclusion. The postscript broke my heart and mended it at the same time. This 8-year-old had recognized that sending me this letter might get her in trouble, but she decided my feelings were worth the risk. She'd chosen kindness over obedience, love over convenience, connection over conflict avoidance. Out of the mouths of babes. This child had understood something that the adults in her family had failed to grasp. That love means making sure everyone has a place. That celebration means including everyone who matters. That family means no one gets left behind. Her father, my son, had told her I lived far now, which was technically true, but didn't explain why I lived far now. He'd given her geography, but not context, distance, but not reason. He'd probably told her it was temporary, that grandma was just visiting the ocean for a while, that things would go back to normal soon. But Emma had seen through the euphemisms. She knew I'd been excluded from something, and she knew exclusion was wrong. She might not understand the adult complexities of financial manipulation and emotional abuse, but she understood fairness. She understood that parties should include people, not exclude them. A party where everyone has a chair. Such a simple concept, such a basic standard of decency. Not a fancy chair, not a special chair, not a chair that required earning or deserving or proving worthiness. Just a chair. A place to sit, a place to belong, a place to be included in the celebration. That's all I'd ever wanted. Not the biggest chair or the most important chair or the chair closest to the birthday boy. Just a chair. Just acknowledgement that I belonged at the table, that my presence added something to the celebration, that excluding me made the party less complete instead of more manageable. This 8-year-old had solved the problem that had baffled the adults. How to have a family celebration that actually included the family. How to throw a party that brought people together instead of pushing them apart. How to celebrate love instead of celebrating exclusion. There's one just for you. She'd thought of me specifically, had drawn my chair deliberately, had made sure I knew there was a place for me in her vision of how family should work. Not just any chair, but my chair. A place that was mine by right, not by invitation. A place that couldn't be taken away by other people's moods or decisions or convenience. The drawing went on the shelf next to my painting supplies, where I could see it from the balcony, where it would remind me daily that love still existed in that family, even if it had become harder to access. Not as a painful reminder of what I'd lost, but as a hopeful reminder of what might still be possible. Emma's letter represented something her father had never learned. How to love without conditions, how to include without resentment, how to maintain relationships without keeping score. She'd reached across the divide her parents had created, had refused to accept their version of family dynamics, had chosen connection over conflict. Some generations repeat mistakes. My son had learned from his father's abandonment, but he learned the wrong lesson. Instead of learning that abandonment hurts and should be avoided, he learned that people leave when relationships become inconvenient. Instead of learning to value family connections, he learned to protect himself by maintaining distance. He'd repeated his father's emotional unavailability in a different form. Where his father had left physically, he'd left emotionally. Where his father had abandoned us completely, he'd abandoned me gradually. Where his father had been cruel through presence, he'd been cruel through absence. But Emma represented the possibility of repair. She was learning different lessons from watching the family dynamics around her. She was learning that exclusion hurts, that isolation is wrong, that love means making room for people. She was developing the emotional skills her father had never mastered, the instincts for inclusion that might break the generational pattern. Children often see more clearly than adults because they haven't yet learned to rationalize cruelty, haven't yet been taught that love is conditional, haven't yet accepted that family relationships require sacrifice from some members and none from others. Emma saw the situation with the clarity of innocence. Grandma was excluded. Exclusion is wrong. The solution is inclusion. Her generation might be the one that repairs the damage, that learns to love without keeping score, that builds family traditions based on inclusion rather than exclusion. She might be the one who teaches her own children that everyone deserves a chair at the table, that celebration means bringing people together, that family means never having to prove you belong. This was the lesson that took me months to understand, the wisdom that emerged slowly from the pain of exclusion. I'd spent so many years focused on earning and maintaining my place at their table that I'd forgotten I could build my own table, serve my own meals, create my own celebrations. Their table had never really been mine anyway. I'd been a guest there, even when I was paying for the table and the chairs and the meals served on it. A guest whose invitation could be revoked at any time, whose place could be eliminated without notice, whose presence was tolerated rather than celebrated. At their table, I'd been performing a version of myself designed to be acceptable, unthreatening, accommodating. The grateful mother, the helpful mother-in-law, the woman who was always available but never demanding, always giving but never expecting reciprocal care. I'd been trying so hard to be worthy of inclusion that I'd lost track of who I actually was. Finding my own home meant rediscovering my own preferences, my own rhythms, my own definitions of celebration and comfort and joy. It meant learning that solitude could be chosen rather than imposed, that independence could be empowering rather than isolating, that self-sufficiency could be freedom rather than abandonment. My own home wasn't just the cottage by the ocean, though that was part of it. My own home was the space I'd created inside myself where my worth wasn't dependent on other people's approval, where my happiness wasn't contingent on other people's inclusion, where my sense of belonging came from self-acceptance rather than external validation. At my own table, I could be myself completely. No performance, no adjustment, no careful monitoring of my words or behaviors to avoid triggering someone else's discomfort. No walking on eggshells, no second-guessing my reactions, no apologizing for having needs or feelings or boundaries. The loss of their table had felt like death at first, the death of a relationship, the death of a dream, the death of the family structure I'd been working so hard to maintain. But death and birth are sometimes the same process. Losing my place at their table had given birth to my own table, my own home, my own life lived according to my own values. People would probably call what I did revenge. Taking away their house, disrupting their security, forcing them to face consequences for their treatment of me. From the outside, it probably looked like a calculated attack designed to hurt them the way they'd hurt me. But revenge had never been the point. Revenge would have been about making them suffer, about ensuring they felt as much pain as they'd caused me, about punishing them for their cruelty. Revenge would have been motivated by anger and focused on their experience rather than my own. What I'd done was about self-respect. About finally treating myself with the dignity I deserved, about finally enforcing boundaries I should have established years earlier, about finally aligning my actions with my values instead of constantly compromising my values to maintain a relationship that was harming me. Self-respect meant recognizing that I didn't have to accept poor treatment just because it came from family members. It meant understanding that love without respect isn't really love, that generosity without appreciation becomes enabling, that sacrifice without reciprocity becomes martyrdom. Self-respect meant valuing my own well-being enough to remove myself from situations that consistently damaged it. It meant caring about my own feelings enough to protect them from people who didn't care about my feelings. It meant believing I deserved better treatment and being willing to enforce that belief through action. The healing didn't come from their panic or their regret or their desperate attempts to repair the relationship after it was too late. The healing came from knowing I'd finally stood up for myself, from experiencing what it felt like to have boundaries that couldn't be crossed, from discovering that I could survive and even thrive without their approval. Revenge would have left me empty because it would have been about them. Self-respect filled me up because it was about me. Revenge would have been a temporary satisfaction followed by more emptiness. Self-respect was a permanent foundation for building a better life. The difference between revenge and self-respect is the difference between reaction and choice. Revenge is reactive. It's about responding to what they did to you. Self-respect is active. It's about choosing what you do for yourself. This might be the most important lesson of all, the one that took me decades to learn and cost me years of unnecessary pain. I'd been so invested in the idea that family meant biology, that blood relationships were automatically more important than chosen relationships, that I owed my son loyalty simply because I'd given birth to him. But biology doesn't create love, behavior does. Sharing DNA doesn't guarantee respect, consideration, or care. Being related doesn't mean you're required to accept poor treatment, and giving birth doesn't mean you're obligated to subsidize someone's lifestyle indefinitely regardless of how they treat you. Real family, the kind that matters, the kind that nourishes your soul, the kind that makes life richer and more meaningful, is about behavior, not biology. It's about people who show up for you, who consider your feelings, who include you in their joy, who make you feel valued and appreciated and loved. Real family members never make you question your belonging. They don't make you wonder if you're welcome. Don't make you feel like you're imposing. Don't treat your love like an obligation they're tired of carrying. They don't send you messages that exclude you from celebrations. Don't make you feel like you have to earn your place at their table. With real family, belonging is assumed, not negotiated. Your place at the table is permanent, not provisional. Your value is recognized, not debated. Your presence is celebrated, not tolerated. I'd spent so many years trying to force a biological relationship to function like a chosen family that I'd forgotten what real family actually felt like. I'd been so focused on the family I'd given birth to that I'd lost track of the family I could choose. People who actually enjoyed my company, who actively sought out my presence, who made me feel good about myself instead of constantly questioning my worth. Emma's letter reminded me that real family can emerge from biological family, but it's not automatic. Her choice to reach out to me, to risk getting in trouble to maintain our connection, to include me in her vision of how family should work, that was family behavior. That was love in action, not love as obligation. Blood might make you related, but it doesn't make you family. Family is what happens when people choose each other, support each other, and refuse to let each other face the world alone. Family is what happens when love is expressed through action, not just claimed through genetics. Thank you for listening to my story, for staying with me through the pain and the anger and the slow journey toward peace, for understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling someone to treat you poorly, for recognizing that boundaries aren't walls, they're bridges to healthier relationships. This story isn't really about revenge or real estate or family drama. It's about the moment when you finally decide you deserve better treatment and you're willing to enforce that belief through action. It's about the courage it takes to walk away from relationships that harm you, even when those relationships are with people you love deeply. It's about learning that you can't love someone into respecting you, can't sacrifice your way into being valued, can't give enough to guarantee you'll receive what you need in return. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop trying to prove your worth to people who've already decided you don't have any. If you've found yourself in a similar situation, being taken for granted by people you've supported, being excluded by family members you've helped, being treated poorly by people you love, please know that you have choices. You have power. You have the right to expect better treatment and the ability to enforce that expectation. You don't have to accept cruelty from people just because they're related to you. You don't have to fund your own mistreatment. You don't have to keep giving to people who only take. You don't have to remain at tables where you're not welcome. Share your story if you feel comfortable doing so. Let others know they're not alone in experiencing this kind of pain. Sometimes just knowing that other people have faced similar situations and survived them can provide the courage needed to make difficult but necessary changes. Have you ever had to choose between maintaining a relationship and maintaining your self-respect? Have you ever had to walk away from people you loved because staying was costing you too much of yourself? Have you ever discovered that someone you thought cared about you is actually just using you? These experiences are more common than we talk about. Family dynamics can be incredibly complex and painful, and sometimes the people who should love us most are the ones who hurt us deepest. But they're also the ones who have the most power to make us question our own worth, to make us accept treatment we would never tolerate from strangers. Your experiences matter. Your feelings are valid. Your boundaries are necessary. Your self-respect is non-negotiable. That text message, "It's for family only," was devastating when I first read it. It felt like a rejection of everything I'd given, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd tried to be for my son. It felt like 38 years of motherhood being dismissed with 6 casual words. But looking back now, from the peace of my cottage by the ocean, I can see that text message differently. It wasn't just painful, it was revelatory. It wasn't just a rejection, it was information. It wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. That text woke me up from years of self-deception. It forced me to see clearly what I'd been trying not to see, that I'd been participating in a relationship that was harming me, that I'd been enabling treatment I didn't deserve, that I'd been so afraid of losing someone that I'd already lost myself. Sometimes the most painful experiences are also the most necessary ones. Sometimes you have to be hurt badly enough to finally get angry enough to change. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you needed to discover what you actually need. That text message was a gift, though it took me months to recognize it as such. It was the push I needed to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. It was the wake-up call I needed to remember my own worth. It was the catalyst I needed to finally choose myself. The most painful texts are often the ones that tell us truths we've been avoiding, that force us to face realities we've been denying, that make it impossible to continue pretending everything is fine when everything is actually broken. But they're also the texts that can save us. The ones that shock us into action, that break through our denial, that give us the clarity we need to make changes we should have made years earlier. If you've received a text like that, one that shattered your illusions and broke your heart but also opened your eyes, maybe it's time to consider what it's trying to tell you. Maybe it's time to stop reading it as just pain and start reading it as information. Maybe it's time to let it wake you up instead of just hurt you. Because sometimes the most painful awakening is the beginning of the most peaceful sleep.